Alrighty. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marianne Aubin Le Quéré, and I'm especially grateful that her website reassures us that correct pronunciation is optional, because she's soon heading to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign to start as an assistant professor, so that's a mouthful. Marianne is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, worked with Andy and I, where she studies how AI and emerging technologies are reshaping online news and well-being. Something I deeply appreciate about working with Marianne is her skill in conducting almost any kind of research, from interview studies to complex quantitative work, but also how daring and excited she is about trying to go beyond her comfort zone, from building mobile apps to developing complex onboarding procedures to thousands of participants. So with that said, the floor is yours, Marianne. We're looking very much for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be here, of course. I wanted to start with a little bit of context. I think, like Miranda, I faced this question of what do I want to do with this time? And there's an easy version of this talk that is a rehashing of my job talk, but instead I figured I would align this with really one of the goals of the postdoc that I have here, which is to flesh out a little bit of my research agenda going into my upcoming faculty position. So I guess the goal here is to arrive at interesting and bigger questions and not necessarily to provide a lot of answers. Kind of going hand in hand with that is that really today I'll be presenting a lot of works in progress. Part of that is going to be really unsatisfying because the conclusion is going to be, this is a pilot study, we don't know if it'll hold. But the really positive aspect to that is a lot of this is super open to collaboration, to getting in new voices, and if you have questions or feedback, a majority of the time these can actually be directly incorporated. And just before we get started, there are a couple of specific people here, of course, that I need to thank. And so Andy and Manuel, of course, some of our work together is represented here. And Inhua also has done a lot of work that I'm presenting today, so including some new results. So keep your eyes peeled. And also some results from my lab at Cornell that I just left. Oh. Okay, great. Okay, so starting off, why should you trust me? Well, I have a PhD, and if you don't believe me, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can go online, you can search my name, and you're going to find some official-looking things from princeton.edu, and it's going to tell you that I have a PhD from Cornell. But really anyone could have a little bit written this. If you want to go one level further, if you have some technical expertise, and if you know a little bit about the academic space, something really convincing that you could do is you could go to the Cornell archives, and you could look through the list of published theses, and you will find my name on there as a recipient of a Cornell thesis, or writer of a Cornell thesis. And that is pretty compelling evidence that I have a PhD. The other thing that you could do is you could look at me, and you could see that I'm wearing a blazer, and you could assume that that means that I must be trustworthy. And part of the argument that I want to make today is that journalists have gotten really good at this verification piece of checking that somebody has a PhD, but audiences today are mostly making assumptions of credibility based on whether or not somebody is wearing a blazer. And so what I'm hoping to do is find some ways to align the PhD and the blazer. And ideally, I think we should be working towards a system, a structural system, where in order to wear the blazer, you have to have the PhD. So I'll start by talking a little bit about this idea of journalism as an epistemic process. Then I'll talk to you about measuring news knowledge, the outcome of journalism. I will touch on how that can come at a cost, how we can be informed, but that can come at the cost of something. We'll talk about what Gen AI has been adding to the equation recently and how it might contribute credibility and usability trade-off. And finally, I'll try to wrap up, semi-hopefully, towards a better information future. So this is kind of this broad question that I want to start with. So how do we know that we know what we know? And some of the 90s babies in the room might know that this was originally formulated on the TV show Friends with, they don't know that we know, they know we know. But really, the way that we know what we know tends to be through a set of epistemic processes. This is not an official definition, this is my definition, so feel free to correct me, but I'm defining here epistemic processes as accepted standards to create, acquire, validate, and communicate knowledge. There's one standard that many of us know very well, right? So science as an epistemic process, and there are many, many things that go into creating knowledge through science. Things like peer review, pre-registrations, having norms for statistical reportings, making sure that we get degrees like PhDs in order to contribute to fields. Another epistemic process that resembles this is the legal process. I know very little about the legal process, but I do know things that you have to do things like following a precedent, that there are rules of evidence for what is and is not admissible in court. I just did jury duty, so I know that there is a requirement of peer judgment, or that can happen. And again, you have this concept of legal degrees to be able to practice law. The one that I'll focus on today is journalism. And I think, again, there are these structures in place to enhance the creation of knowledge. So journalists will vet sources, they have standards of attribution for what their sources say, there are editorial reviews, and fact-checking that occurs. I'll focus on this today, and one of the reasons why I personally find journalism really fascinating in this context is because scientists or lawyers, for example, will communicate to audiences that are often themselves specialized. So we are rarely communicating directly with the public. Often we're actually writing papers that are meant for other scholars or doing epistemic work that is meant to be received by people who understand the context and the background we're coming from. Journalists don't have that luxury. Journalists are really providing information directly to lay audiences, and so they have this additional translational challenge of creating knowledge and then also making sure that audiences understand how that knowledge was created. So quickly touching on what is journalism and what makes it an epistemic process. Again, this is self-labeled, but I'm considering, for the sake of this talk, journalism as being the epistemic process that guides the public to know and make judgments about salient civic information. And so that includes things like selecting which items actually warrant our attention, what should we be paying attention to, or agenda setting theory, as this is often referred to. There's this idea of sourcing. What is the available evidence? How can we gather that? And then, of course, hand in hand with that is verification, or vetting the evidence. Is the evidence that we have reliable? Does it make sense to draw conclusions from? And then there's this idea of communication, of transparency. How can we make sure that the public is following the reasoning that we took to get there? I want to pause for a sec on #NotAllJournalists. I think I'm painting a little bit of a rosy picture of how this might be occurring. There are many places, especially places that are more resource-strapped or places in more local areas, where this will not always be followed to the letter. I'm kind of talking about the standard here and what I think is achievable. And I want to zoom in a little bit on this idea of journalists and what they think raises credibility compared with what audiences think raises credibility. Because journalists, I talked about them already, but they're going to validate sources. They attribute things if a source has agreed to be on record. They have a code of ethics. They have bylines that say who the author was, what is their beat, what is their area of expertise. They have corrections and updates to articles. All of these things are done in service of making sure that the information is correct and trustable. And it does serve some audiences. I think that audience is getting smaller and smaller. So certainly other journalists understand these epistemic trust cues. People who are highly media literate, many people in this room, I think, fit this category. They will understand these cues. And of course, there's this like news junkies audience that I think will be able to follow these as well. But we also have to face that audience trust cues look very, very different. So for example, audiences really rely on things like website design, how professional does your website look, social signals, how many people have liked or engaged with this information, this increases trust, and even things like emotional delivery can signal authenticity and can inspire trust in audiences. And then of course there are providers that meet these cues, which are sometimes journalists and news organizations, but they can also be things like large influencers where you see this sort of social salience. AI-generated content, right, is really good at portraying this sense of credibility, and we'll dive into that more. Recently, there have been these pink slime news websites that emulate trustable and credible news websites, but we can see that these are all providers that are good at emulating trustworthiness, but not actually at having necessarily trustworthy content. So that's the central challenge here, is how do we better align these two things? One example, news article corrections, when you go back and you say this part of an article was actually wrong, that is something that is a sign of trustworthiness because it means that the organization cares enough to issue that correction. But in fact, it's usually interpreted by audiences the other way around. It's usually interpreted as I should trust this organization less because they made a mistake. So that's one really good way of thinking about this discrepancy. And here I think is where my human-computer interaction side comes out a little bit, which is that I really firmly believe that this mismatch is not a user error. And we can do kind of as much media literacy training as we like, but there's something really fundamental here about human nature, I think. And I would also encourage you to think, like, it's very easy to think this does not apply to you. I think this applies to everybody to some degree. We're not immune from it. And I think instead it's a failure of systems, platforms, and regulations to protect users from this kind of influence. So with that in mind, going into the first section, I want to talk to you a little bit about why we should care about news and journalism. So I'd like you, put your hand up if you think journalism or news is important in any way. Okay, keep your hand up if you're willing to say why. Yes.
Because it's important for people, especially citizens that are voting or making important decisions, to be informed of the world around.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was hoping you would say. So there are a bunch of other things that are important about journalism. It holds power to account. It is a watchdog entity. It can serve for community building. But the first thing that comes to mind is informing the public, right? And I put it as part of this chain where the societal purpose of journalism is to verify information in order to inform the public so that they can take important civic action. But I want to focus on this notion of informedness, because even though it's the very first thing we think of when we think of the purpose of journalism, it actually is not something that we often measure. We tend to measure news use, not the actual outcomes of news, of whether people are informed. So we'll measure things like news use, news exposure, news attitudes. But if the primary purpose of journalism is to inform people, I would argue that is the goal we should be understanding if it meets. So there is, in fact, a metric for understanding informedness, which is called news knowledge. This specific one is also called news discernment. It's very easy to get a hang of, and we'll demonstrate it here. Put your hand up if in the past 2 weeks you think this happened. Okay, it did in fact happen. Put your hand up if you think this happened in the past 2 weeks. Nice. This one again happened. Put your hand up if you think this one happened in the past 2 weeks. It did not. Okay, so we've already sort of started to get at this. This is exactly what this metric does. It shows you a set of true things that have happened recently and a set of false things that have not happened but could have happened, like this item, and then it asks you to distinguish between them. And you get this overall score based on how well you do at distinguishing. But this is a super hard metric to implement, even though the thing I like about it is it's a little bit hard to cheat your way out of. Like, it kind of is what you know and what you don't know. But it is pretty hard to measure. I have implemented it myself many times, and it takes a lot of researcher time and energy because it is inherently always changing. This also introduces validity concerns, where different researchers could select different types of items, and so it makes it difficult to compare between studies. And on top of that, even if it's the same researcher, you might have a different criteria for selecting items from one week to the next. And so it becomes very hard to compare even within participants within the same study. And so one of the things I've been working on here is the idea of combining replicable news item selection with AI-generated survey items to create an automated news knowledge metric that can update every week. So the pipeline here that I've implemented, every day it goes and collects a set of headlines from the Internet Archive from 9 US news sources that are politically diverse. One of the things I like about this is you really just need the headlines and you can go directly to the web archive. So you don't have a lot of the ethical concerns of scraping news outlets really deeply on a daily basis. And then once a week, I go in and I cluster them into news events that have happened that week. The second step is this idea of generating these survey items and then systematically validating them. So right now I'm using DeepSeek so that we have an open source model that goes in, and for each cluster of headlines, it creates a news summary. So the ones you just rated were actually all done by DeepSeek. So these are the types of news items that it's generating. And then I have a validation pipeline. I'm actually not sure whether or not to keep it because it's working decently well without the validation, but the idea is to, it like automatically creates a Qualtrics survey of the items every week, and then it can deploy it on Prolific so that you can get 10 raters or so just to make sure that the items are accurate, that they're not biased, things like that. I've implemented that a couple of times. Again, it thus far has not been necessary. Maybe eventually it will be very necessary, and then I'll be glad that it's there, but open to feedback here. And then the ultimate outcome that I'm hoping for is to really deploy this with a public-facing researcher API. And so we could release this sort of every week, include what the Prolific raters have rated headlines that week, maybe also release it monthly, and then just have this be a publicly accessible resource. For validation, this is still a little slim, but I had one journalist who went through and created a bunch of news items for 1 week, and I compared that with our automated items. 5 of the 10 items were matched with that journalist, but 3 of the ones that they selected happened in the last day or 2. And I had actually implemented something where it has to happen at least 3 days during that week. So it would be represented in the next week, if that makes sense. So that's something I can definitely work on, but at a high level, the most important items were selected. And then again, right now, this was the first pass. The crowd workers preferred the journalists 52% of the time, so about even. I think there's improvements to be done here, but as a first pass, it's pretty good, and I've updated some of the models since. So with that in mind, I'm really excited about potential extensions. I hope people will talk to me about things to do here. There is, of course, this public API for social scientists. But what's very cool is you can kind of replicate this with any set of sources. And so one potential extension is you could actually create a separate news knowledge, for example, for right-leaning versus left-leaning sources to understand that kind of salience. You could also do that for example, local information or local place. And specific types of sub-communities. So I'm excited about where that can go. And we can even think a level further. Right now, it's really hard to understand how well models perform with live news that's happening, because again, it's hard to always be updating these. But you could imagine extending this, for example, to a benchmark of how well LLMs can actually answer questions about live happenings. To give you context there, I accidentally searched a couple of these in Google AI overviews recently, and it showed me that they must be factually incorrect because the Tiger Woods crash happened in 2007, the Houthi attacks happened in 2023, and Donald Trump is not currently president. So, all right, so hopefully I've convinced you this is a decent metric for measuring how well journalism is performing at its core task of keeping people informed. But I want to talk a little bit about the cost here. How are we all feeling about the news at the moment? Good? Yeah? Okay, well, we established this metric, right? In theory, it's good to be well informed, and you would go up here and you would get a little check mark because you've done well, you know a lot of stuff. Unfortunately for us, I think many of us might feel that that tends to come at a price. And I want to introduce a second metric here called news anxiety, which is how much does the potential of news happening, of being exposed to news, of news unfurling, how much does that cause anxious responses in people? And here it's the opposite, right? We do not want high news anxiety. We ideally want low news anxiety so that people can be resilient to learning new information. So this is work. This is where we've done a lot of work with Inhua and Manuel. And at the beginning of this, part of our hypothesis was some of us might feel that there's this inherent trade-off between how much we know and how good we feel about it. And so we imagined that if you plot people on a chart like this, you might get something like this, where you have a rough correlation, and as people get more informed, they might also become more anxious. I'm happy to talk about it more. Surprisingly, the research on this does not go in just one or the other direction. There's actually a decent amount of discrepancy. And what we wondered is, well, what would it take to put people up here? What would it take for people to be well-informed, but for this to not be a cost on people on a daily basis? And so we're calling this notion the idea of information well-being, the state of being both normatively informed about current events and having low news anxiety. And here the questions we're interested in are what are the characteristics, the attitudes, and the practices of people that have high information well-being? And how do these relate to news anxiety, news knowledge, or both at once? So if we think back to this quadrant, which I'll refer to a lot, what we're doing is we're actually interviewing people that are up here. So we launched this Quere survey intended at measuring these two dimensions, and then we looked at people that are just in the category of we think you are succeeding in this one way. We interviewed 14 people. We constructed a set of qualitative themes. So some of the themes that stood out to us were people that were actively engaging with the news. So they're looking at many different news sources. They're seeking them out on purpose. They're comparing between different things that they see. There was this idea of social news engagement, so people that are often discussing with close to others to make sense of information in this socially oriented way. The idea of boundary management, of the news exists here in this specific routine or in this specific space, but I'm going to treat it as separate from my daily life, or I'm going to implement steps so that it is separate. For example, turning off notifications, putting my phone in another room when I get stressed. All of these are forms of boundary management. And then another theme was this idea of personal characteristics. So for example, people that said they were more analytical said that that also helped them be less emotional about the news. And as a next step, we constructed a survey to try and understand whether these themes that we found actually translated at scale. So this is just some of the things that we've translated, but each of them become kind of a survey item that we measure. And here is where I have pilot results and pilot results only to present. I think they're already pretty interesting, but what this also means is if you say like, this is total BS and you should change everything, I can. So that's great. I'll bring you back to this chart here. Again, keep this quadrant in your mind. We said earlier, we kind of thought it would follow this correlation, where the more you learn, the more stressed out you get about it. Hands up who here thinks it's going to go this way. So if you learn more, you get more stressed. Anyone thinks it's going to go the opposite way? So people who are more stressed about the news actually know less about them. Maybe they don't want to be exposed, and so because they know they'll be stressed. You know? Anybody who thinks there's going to be no correlation at all? No relationship? Okay. So a few people have it right. This is only a survey, but a pilot, but we have done this pilot once before and we found the same thing. Almost exactly zero correlation. But still a really big spread. And so I'll translate some of this into numbers. The first thing that stands out to me is, again, only 110 people, but we have about 40% that are on the left side, meaning they're not anxious, and that means 60% of people are actually feeling anxious about the news. And overall, we only have about 20% of people that are in this high information well-being. So only about 20% are feeling positively about the news and informed. Yes?
Just a quick question in anxiousness.
Yes.
Is it anxiety about not knowing enough, or is it anxiety about what's in the news?
It is, so it's derived from a specific metric of political anxiety, which we adapted to the news. It's a composite measure that, what does it include in what? Things like stressed about not knowing enough, but also stress, like I feel stress of things that might happen because of the news, and the negativity of the news makes me anxious, things like that, right? Okay. And yeah, we actually just tested this one, so that one is internally consistent. We did a pretest for that one specifically, but it's a new metric. Great. Any other questions? Yes.
It seems like you're conceptualizing this primarily as a property of a person, but it's also a property of news sources and the information environment, etc. I'm curious if you're trying to get at that.
Yeah, so when we were breaking out all of the things we gathered from the interviews into survey items, we also have things in there about like how much they use social media, for example, how left or right-leaning the outlets are that they use. I don't have the figure in here. It'll definitely be a part of the final analysis, and I can, after I run through the other findings, I'll talk a little bit about those as well. All right, so we'll look a little bit about at the correlations here. I'm going to introduce these quadrant plots that are a little confusing, but I will talk you through them. So this one is the characteristics. There are many more types of characteristics, but I'm focusing on demographics for now. And again, this is the same quadrant. So up here, you have actually feeling less anxious and knowing more about the news. And any lines that are sort of solid means that there's a significant correlation. These are all correlations, all based on pilot data, blah, blah, blah. What we see from these initial findings are that age and education both correlate with higher information level. So the older you are, the less anxious you are, and the more you know about the news. Same with education. Then being male and being a Republican correlate with lower news anxiety. And this is actually fairly well known that if your party is not in power, you tend to be more anxious about what's going on. So that is not surprising, and also there are some gendered association with anxiety specifically. And then I don't have them on this plot, but the other things that are consistent, that are significant when it comes to characteristics, are things like conscientiousness correlates with less anxiety, so being more detail-oriented and logical, what we talked about earlier. And then neuroticism and symptoms of anxiety and depression, unsurprisingly, correlate with higher amounts of anxiety, of news anxiety. Then we can get into the attitudes. And here we're pushing in some different directions, right? So the attitudes that you have, if you are particularly interested in the news, or if you think the news at this very moment is very relevant to you, that is what's going to push you towards higher news knowledge and higher anxiety. Things like feeling like you have a duty to keep up with the news, or you don't have a lot of agency over the news, or you follow the news because you want to know about what's going on in the world. These all correlate with more news anxiety. And then on the other side, news efficacy, so feeling like you can make good decisions based on the news that you're exposed to, correlates with higher news knowledge, and following the news primarily for entertainment purposes correlates with lower news knowledge. No, these are dense plots. There's one more of them, and then we'll move on. Practices, what can you actually change? So again, here there are a couple of practices. I guess one practice that correlates with both high news knowledge and news anxiety, which is news engagement practices. So what we talked about earlier about checking between many different outlets to make sure things are correct, or really going deep on news stories versus reading broadly. These are the really engaged users. That's both high news knowledge and high news anxiety. Curating your news environment, interestingly, correlates with higher news anxiety. I think that might be because if people have very high anxiety, they're then pushed to curating their news environment more. Compartmentalization, I'll come back to in a second. And then seeking news more actively rather than encountering it tends to increase, or sorry, is correlated with increases in news knowledge, and lower social reliance is also correlated with more news knowledge. So unfortunately, if you're relying on others to get your news, you're likely to be less informed, according to this. Yes?
So clarifying question, does the news knowledge metric factor in the source? Or it's just whether you're aware?
It's just about whether you're able to distinguish. And you'll notice it also doesn't, there's no opinion that's being asked here, and they're very purposefully phrased to be as non-partisan as possible. So it's just, do you recognize them? Compartmentalization I wanted to come back to because while there's no silver bullet, this is the closest thing to it. And in some of the correlations I've run since, this actually is holding up decently well as something that seems like can lower news anxiety without impacting your knowledge. So if anyone wants practical tips, this is actually something that I've started doing myself since this study, and I feel like it has helped. And compartmentalization is really reminding yourself that it does not have to interfere with your daily life, and it is trying as much as possible. We have it as a practice because it is a thing that people do. It is reminding yourself actively, this might be stressful, I might not like what is happening. It does not have to interfere with my current daily life. So that's my biggest practical advice, I guess. You'll notice though, I mean, news relevance, how relevant the news is to you, pushed in the other direction. So this is not always feasible to do or to tell yourself, but if it is, I do recommend it. Brief step aside, did anybody notice anything about the past two charts that I showed you? This one and this one? Right, that correlation we were looking for. Again, I don't quite know if it's what it means yet, but what we're seeing here is that all of the practices and attitudes we've identified, so anything that might be changeable, is actually going along this axis, which might suggest that even though people are in these quadrants as profiles, it might be that based on your characteristics, your demographics, you kind of get plonked in one of the quadrants, and then no matter what you try, it's going to pull you diagonally. Which might explain why we feel like there's a trade-off, even if there isn't. But again, these are new results open for debate, and would love to know what you'll think. And back to your question earlier, the one thing that stands out is actually following left-wing and traditional news outlets correlates with the right side, so it increases anxiety. Or again, I'm using the word increase. It correlates with high anxiety. And the one that pushes, and actually I think one of the only ones that pushes us down here, so high anxiety and low news knowledge, is actually if you trust social media. So young audiences that have high trust in social media are going to be pushed down here. Cool, so key takeaways, we went over this already, but it seems like there is more profiles of different types of people rather than actual trade-off. I do think there's finding here that keeping up with the news is costly. So only about 20% of the people in the pilot have high information well-being. That means for about 80% of people, either they're not informed and they're not anxious, or they are informed and they are anxious. And then finally, there's this question of how much of this is actually changeable. So that's this theory I'm working on now, that characteristics can place you in a quadrant, but when you try to get out, you'll always be pulled along that diagonal. Okay, so on top of all of this, now we add Gen AI. It can only get better from here. Understandably, generative AI in the information ecosystem is very relevant to a lot of these things I'm talking about. I gestured to it earlier, but I want to kind of concretize that a little bit. So I've tried to convince you that journalists are good, or at least have systems in place for creating information that is trustworthy and trustable. On the other hand, I do think there is a real strength in Gen AI that it can communicate broadly to the public in ways that seem to, in some ways at least, inspire trust. So we've seen it even here that it's pretty easy to persuade people on a set of topics through AI, and that it can, it can give you information in ways that people like. And I'll exemplify that through an example. So a question I want to touch on here is what happens when untrustworthy information is made to seem credible via generative AI. In order to test something like this, we basically need this underlying variation of environments where we think there is trustworthy information, environments where we think there is untrustworthy information, and then generative AI on top of it to understand what the impact of that could be. Luckily for all of you, I spent a lot of my PhD studying local information ecosystems, and therefore I can tell you that local information ecosystems in a lot of places in the US are really quite bad. A majority of counties do not have a lot of very reliable local news sources, and in fact this is declining by the year. Again, there are these systematic inequalities in the availability of civic information in local areas, and we know that this has these really important real-life consequences, and that places that have a less availability of high-quality information tend to have higher political polarization, they see increased corruption, and they also have eroded civic attitudes. So I'm going to present one last study. I will not go in depth on it at all. I'm happy to talk about it at the end, just to kind of communicate the point. So here we were interested in the impact of Google's generative AI overviews, particularly in information environments that we know to be low quality. So we conducted a Google audit of local information ecosystems, where in each of the 3,000 or so counties in the US, we have a set of 115 civically relevant queries, and we search each county for those queries. So here's some examples. What is Seattle, Washington known for historically? How much would it cost to live in Orangeburg, South Carolina? We did this study twice in May 2025, or we did data collection twice, in May 2025 and then in December 2025 to repeat it. I am curious if folks can take a guess in May what this percentage would have been. I can give you two clues. One is every query is phrased like a question, because we know that questions trigger AI overviews at higher rates. The other is we know local information quality is really bad, and so they may not want to trigger AI overviews over not credible content. Anybody have a guess for what percentage in May of last year?
2050.
What?
20% in May, 50%
Oh, 20
in December. Sorry, that is a lot of percentages otherwise.
Anyone else? Yeah.
40 and 80.
40 and 80. Yeah.
70, 90.
70 and 80. Okay. Who's closest? You might be closest on the first. Oh, no, you're closest on the first one. Sorry. You're closest on the first one. So even in May of last year, about 2/3 of the queries we had were generating an AI review. And then by December, we're now at over 90% that generate an AI review. So it's a lot. When we started analyzing the data, the first thing that became clear is that a very high percentage of results rely on these sources I can only refer to as databases and aggregators, and they have really good names like areavibes.com or neighborhoodscout.com or things like that. And these kinds of websites really don't fulfill any of these epistemological processes I've talked about. So there is usually very little data provenance. Sometimes they cite the census, and that's great. Usually it's a bunch of proprietary algorithms that they will not share with whoever's visiting. There tend to be lots of advertisements to the point that you think that that might be the reason why they exist. And of course, these are aggregations of data that really don't have a lot of local context. So you'll search for how much it costs to live in that area, and you get these results that are returned to you through the AI overview that don't seem to be based on very credible information. And this is where I'll start going really quickly, and you might not want me to, but if we look at underlying demographic information, one thing that becomes clear is that indeed the types of sources that are being relied upon change a lot based on where you're doing the search. So if you're in a place where we think the information environment might not be as good, in lower population areas or lower educated areas, you see a lot more databases. We're at 38% on this side, and then all the way down to 28%, about a 10% drop when you go to places that have a higher quality of information environment. So that's when it comes to sources. The second thing is we see this actually does also impact the actual linguistic features that are in the AI overview itself. I just selected one, which is the word count. But again, you can see we're starting at about 182 words per AI overview for the lower information areas, but then we go up to 190 words for the higher information areas. One of the questions that I had with this study is, okay, if I'm a user and I'm looking at a list of sources, I can at least filter through or evaluate the sources if they're being shown to me in this way. But if I'm a user, am I really judging whether an AI overview has like 8 more words as more credible? I'm not so sure. Anyway, I'm happy to go more in depth on that, but I won't dwell on it too much. The next thing that we did is we tried to understand whether these differences in the information that is being provided actually lead to different perceptions of that information by the audience. And again, here's another pilot study, I'm sorry. But what we do find is that AI overviews are perceived as more relevant and more credible than search engine results pages. So again, I won't explain too much, but we have a few experimental conditions. This one on the right for both of them is the AI overview, and on the left is the same sources that are in the AI overview and the actual sources that are provided by the Google search result. And at least in our pilot findings, they are perceived as more relevant and more credible when you have this AI overview text that goes with them. There's a couple of potential takeaways here. There is a risk framing, which is that the study can demonstrate how Gen AI can lead to the perception that untrustworthy content is actually trustworthy, regardless of the epistemic process that underlies it. I do think there's also an opportunity framing here, which is that the study demonstrates one of the ways that generative AI can make hard to parse civic information actually more approachable and less cognitively costly. So people actually like it more in some of the ways that we might measure. And so again, I think there's a key challenge here, which is can we combine the strengths of journalism and generative AI to produce trustworthy and trusted information at low cognitive cost? And here's where I want to take us in the end. What are different ways that we could imagine a better information future? I don't have one answer, but I have a few case studies that I hope will be inspirational. So first is this idea of chatbots for news consumption. We might think this is horrible, and indeed the early studies from Pew show that not a lot of people are doing this at all. But a colleague, Nick Hagar, was talking to me about an experiment that he ran where he exposed people in a lab environment to a news chatbot for the first time. And this is a journalism guy, and he said they loved it. Like he said, nobody had done it, nobody had thought of it, but it solves a lot of the issues that we talked about because it provides you with one stream of information. You don't have to sort through a bunch of different things to see what you trust more. It's personalized. You can ask follow-up questions about only the things you care about. And there's not going to be that emotional phrasing that makes people really untrustworthy, like not trust the media. Another is, some of you might be familiar with, but is Bonsai, this idea of using large language models to curate your online information better. I think there's a lot of potential here for news curation by letting users control their algorithms a little better. Again, you could actually limit that emotional phrasing, or you might imagine saying, after 8 p.m., I just never want to see any news on my social feeds. Or you might highlight certain types of news delivery, right? You might want it either to be coming directly from news sources or from journalists themselves, whatever it might be. That's a second case study. And then the third one I came up with, so it's a lot less well-developed than these other two. But I've been trying to push towards this model of modularizing the news, which I think unfortunately goes with journalists stepping away a little bit from the notion that the writing is what really matters and what people will consume, because I don't think that's what's happening today. So we might imagine an interaction like a user coming to ChatGPT and asking a news-related question. And ChatGPT might flag that this is news relevant or civically important. And then it could go to a news provider, whether this is a specific news provider or whether this is a larger kind of system or entity that would have a whole bunch of different options to select from. Maybe this question happens often enough that there can be a preset list of questions, but there could also be verification or entailment APIs where ChatGPT says, here's what I would like to say to this user. Are you willing to stand behind it as a news company? And you might be able to develop specialized tools for that. We can talk about the citation bank. They would feed this back to ChatGPT, which could then present it to the user. Importantly, I think there needs to be a transaction here, right? News companies ought to be paid for this kind of service, and that can be one way that payment stream can happen and be sustainable. And then you could dress it up in a blazer, or and you could actually give like some kind of mark of approval, or alternatively, you can say, actually, we're not willing to provide this information unless it has been vetted by this API ecosystem. In order for something like this to work, of course, you would need platforms that are actually willing to enforce provenance chains for societally important topics. You need media organizations that embrace modular content provision. You need markets that are going to prioritize the payment of original content providers. And of course, you need regulation that helps set standards for information integrity across the web. So a long way to go, but this is how I envision something like this might work. And the final provocation I want to leave you on is just that journalism and generative AI have inverse credibility usability trade-offs. And for me, the goal is to combine them to enable broad access to information that I hope is both usable and credible. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing. So we have plenty of time for questions. I might start with one. Oh, sorry. Here, please go ahead.
This is great talk. One question I had as you think about the framing of journalism is roughly you can think of journalism as part opinions and then part information.
Sorry, who thinks that?
Opinions and information, right? That you sort of see in the public that journalism tends to be veering more toward the opinion side of it and away from the information provision side. It's almost like, in my head, information providers at Reuters, Bloomberg, places like that, whereas opinion-inflected information is more other sources, if you will. And I'm wondering how you think about that, sort of how you're thinking about journalism, the opinion piece side of journalism in this framework.
Yeah, so you're asking a little bit about selection of information, right? Of like how journalism can contribute to the saliency or agenda setting.
Right.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't have a great answer for you. I think there's a sense to which part of that I would argue has already been lost. Like I am not sure if it is still the case that news media is necessarily dictating what gets talked about or responding to what is picking up traction in the information ecosystem. I think there's a degree to which you could have a little bit of both, like maybe in this like information ecosystem I talked about, you could have some that are more like what are opinions that the New York Times is willing to stand behind as an information provider, but it's a good, I would need to think about it a little bit more. And that's been actually, I have talked to journalists about parts of this, and that's been some of their pushback is like, well, I actually think that the point of my work is to provide context. It's not to provide the underlying information. So.
Yeah, I had a version of the very same question. I know you've mostly answered it, but I just wanted to put a fine point on it. There's research, for instance, from Duncan Watts and others that the reason that you have partisan polarization is because when media adopts a certain framing, that is perceived as much more credible by their respective partisan audiences. And it's true that many audiences now are rejecting that, but in a world where there's going to be chatbot intermediation, it's hard to see a future for the New York Times as opposed to the AP or Axios or Political or Bloomberg, like you were mentioning. This seems like, the death knell for some of these.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the New York Times itself is doing fairly well, but I do think like I don't know, it feels to me like an extension of this is like, I think local news outlets mostly is all going to be data that gets pulled in and maybe gets some context added to it from somewhere, but mostly not based on journalism. And then I feel like you get like the like tippity top of like outlets that manage to be sustainable, or those that manage to like, like there are people that want to read very long pieces and they'll follow very specific outlets, and those might find a path to sustainability. Yeah.
This is a fascinating presentation. I was listening to it thinking of a letter written by a German author, Goethe, who was writing at the turn of the 19th century. He was super stressed out. His revolutions were sweeping over Europe. There's a lot going on. And he had a philosophy of news consumption, which was that he would consume, I'm making up the details, but it was like roughly like this, like super local news every day, and then news in his kind of like broader area once a week, and then news from far-flung parts of the world maybe every month or something like that. I think a lot of that was just mediated by technology, so it took a lot more time for news from far-flung parts of the world to reach him. But you can kind of see how there was like a how he might naturally have been placed in a healthy news consumption quadrant, just in virtue of the fact that the news he was most frequently consuming was the kind of news that was more directly connected to the sort of agency he would have been able to exercise. I wonder if the hollowing out of local news in the US, and I guess perhaps around the world, has led to some sort of reversal of that dynamic where, is it like, does the absence of local news create a vacuum that is filled by greater consumption of news from far-flung parts of the world? And does that contribute to increased news anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, you directly see some of that. First of all, I love that you mentioned, you said it was Goethe, right, that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Because I grew up in Jena, where he was either born or spent a lot of time, because everything was called after Goethe. Yes, so the most direct evidence towards that, I think, is that places where that have fewer local newspapers see more polarized voting, suggesting that some of that attention is getting reoriented. So even when you're voting in a local election, you're more likely to vote along with your, the way that you vote in the national election when you have less information about the politicians that are in front of you. So that seems to be at least partly happening. I'm really curious to know, I proposed this in a grant recently about measuring local news knowledge and who is actually up to date on local news knowledge and things like that. I spend a lot of my time in the PhD looking at local online spaces like Nextdoor and Facebook groups and things like that. But with those, mostly you find a lot of what is true about local news is also true about these spaces, which is people that are on there tend to be more educated, have access to internet, are older. It's kind of recreating a lot of the things that we see elsewhere, I would say.
It was great. I have two questions, if
Yes.
I can. I mean, so one was specifically about the Google search audit. My sense from the examples that you showed were that those were less about kind of current events, in the news, and more just kind of general informational queries. So is that the case? And if so, do you think that distinction would make a difference? If you were to do an audit where you're asking about either events that have local implications or just things that are, elections or things that are happening locally.
Yeah. I'm gonna forget if you don't stop there.
I'll stop
so
there.
Keep yes, we have both.
Okay.
We use Waldman's community information needs framework to ask about transportation, health, crime and safety, which is how we get all of the more generally oriented queries. But we also specifically have some about events and local news that's happening. The biggest distinction is local news is it shows up here and there, but it's 5 to 10% maybe of the results that we usually see. The only category where it's heavily featured is in events and news. That is the only time it comes up a lot in locally oriented queries.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, then my other one, I think a version of this has already been asked, but I'm interested in I think your suggestion that this diagonal, there's something natural about this diagonal line. And I wonder if perhaps that's true now, right? Or in the you kind of you're using US data now, but I wonder if there's something about relatively calm times, wartime versus peacetime, if you would find a different pattern, because I do think there's something about the results that you're getting, which could derive from just a correlation that is occurring in the world between consuming more news and being more worried or stressed, but that could be more or less true in different places at different times. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, should we do a cross-country analysis?
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting.
I also had two questions about the one that's, I like the modularization of news. I think what's sort of interesting to me is that how do you assume, I mean, it would mean that news organizations have to change radically in a sense that like they do fact check. I mean, most reporters fact check their own articles or whatever they output the day off, but they don't really retroactively fact check, right?
Yeah.
Like something might come out 3 weeks later, but you don't update something written 3 weeks ago. So that might be a real problem for an LLM if it like queries sort of the whole archive of the New York Times and goes to something that is wrong.
Yeah.
Because we have updated information that may not be reflected in that corpus of that news organization.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tackle where you started that question first, which is that like, I think this is not ideal, but I think this would be a reasonable place to start. What I worry will happen instead is that we will see brokers or intermediators that do this part and get the money, and we never figure out how to feed it back to the information providers, and that I think that's, I mean, prevent is a strong word, but like I think that that's the direction that things are going right now, and I worry about where that leaves news outlets in terms of financial sustainability. So it is very different. I hope we can work with them to get there.
Yeah.
I think we're doing our best. So.
And my other question was about sort of the results of the LLM queries. Do they change if you know if news organizations in the area block LLMs from extracting anything? Because that has been, like we see that a lot, right? That now like actually because most Canadian media organizations now try to block any scraping. So we see like weirdly enough like Indian news sources being like in the summarization at the top of Canadian news if you have like a Canadian query. So it's kind of interesting.
Long story short, I haven't done that analysis specifically because as soon as you try and combine it with news data sets, it's such a small proportion of the total number of sources and queries that it doesn't feel like the question to start with. But I've had a lot of people that want me to specifically look at the news sites. But to Andy's point, they're not always going to be relevant. So, I mean, we could just construct it with, like, we have one that's like, what's the most recent news in X? And we could literally just use that data set.
Interesting. So on this question, I had the instinct that maybe a base LLM or chatbot would misinterpret the question. So I went to Gemini and asked, why are we at war with Iran? And it gave me only Trumpian answers. Right. So like, my question would be like, how's it resolving what the intention of the user is when it puts in a query like that? Meaning, like if it's resolving it as an attempt to get factual analysis, then the Democrat saying, I have no idea why we're at war with Iran, comes out as a non-claim, whereas in fact it's a claim. It's a political claim. And so instead at least the base model, it's not modularized in the way that you're saying. The base model of Gemini interpreted this only as, let me give things that are stated as positive reasons for the war with Iran. So it said the failure of nuclear diplomacy, attempt to remove leadership. It gives me like 5, and they're all of Trump's reasons.
I mean, I think to me, like, I don't know. Again, I struggle with this because I think you kind of hit a wall in terms of like, I just think at some point you do need regulations or at least standards. And like, I don't think this is a completely non-tractable problem. I think you can sit down and you can solve for this, but I think there has to be consensus that needs to be done. And not only consensus that needs to be done, but then that things need to be implemented based off of it, right? So for example, again, you have one version of this where like you have really strong regulation for exactly these types of queries or things need to go through an additional filtering layer. And these are the types of things we accept as an additional filtering layer. And if it does not go through that layer, then you're not allowed to generate a response, right? That's like all things that are theoretically possible, but you just need systems that are going to support it. And I don't know that we're there right now. I do know that some of the things that we can work on is better benchmarking and understanding how the models are currently performing in situations that seem like they're the most high stakes. And that at least can be one avenue to push. But yeah, I think you just need enforcement.
Awesome. Let's thank, like, we kind of went all over the